So, Bruchim Abayim, welcome everybody. So when I was looking at this week's Parsha, first of all, the Parsha itself is compelling in a number of ways. As you're probably aware, it starts off with the incident, more actions by Aaron in terms of getting things ready in the Mishkan and offering the first sacrifices, although we've been reading about different types of sacrifices for a couple of weeks now already. And of course, the very interesting incident with his two sons, which I'll come back to a little bit later. And it finishes off with another detailed explanation of what is kosher and what isn't kosher. And that in itself would be a fascinating discussion, how we deal with kashrut. But we'll leave that for another day, because kashrut is mentioned in a few times in the Torah. And although the one detailing which animals and which creatures are kosher and for what reasons are described and explained in this week's Parsha, as I said, that'll be for another discussion. So I wanted to start off with the fact that today, in addition to having read Shmini, is a fairly important day in the Jewish calendar. And I wanted to ask you a couple of questions, and I'll do it in a visual way as well. So let me know when the screen comes up on yours. Good. Okay. So what's the name of, what do we call today? What's the name of today? What's the special day in the Hebrew calendar called?
Yom.
Isn't it Yom HaShoah?
Yeah.
Yom HaShoah. Okay. Anybody else? So you're probably wondering, is this some kind of trick question? No, it's not a trick question. It's a matter of semantics. Sometimes we use certain names, both for ourselves, for our communities, and for our community and cultural commemorations. And sometimes we get used to a certain name without thinking the impact of the name. So what am I trying to say? Yom HaShoah, if you translate it literally, it means Holocaust Day. That's often the way we translate Shoah. But there's a fuller name that perhaps is more descriptive and what many would say is a more appropriate, and I'll even use the word inclusive way of thinking about the events that occurred more than 70 years ago already. The full name, as designated by the Israeli Knesset back in the 1950s, is Yom HaZikaron LaShoah VeLaGvura, Memorial Day for the Holocaust and bravery. Because when we have to be very careful with the names we use, because when we call it out of convenience, I would say more than anything else, not because of we're being thoughtless or insensitive or anything, God forbid, that's not the reason. But it's a lot easier to have a name for a day that has two words as opposed to all the other words that I added as the official name. But if you think about it, when you talk about Holocaust Day, certain things are conjured up. When you talk about Memorial Day for the Holocaust and for bravery, probably other things are conjured up as well. Maybe, I don't know. So what I would ask is, and maybe just put it in the chat box if you don't want to say it out loud, what image is conjured up first for you when you hear the word Shoah? So we hear that often, and sometimes a little too often, but when you hear the word Shoah, what is the first image that comes up in your head? You can either write that or just share it verbally out loud. Okay, so barbed wire, a museum. Anyone else? Okay, that's interesting. So everybody has their own images of what Shoah means. And I would imagine that many of us have perhaps difficult to share, but much harsher pictures in mind when we think of the Shoah. And that really often affects the way we enter into some kind of commemoration. So if we're not marking it with any type of community commemoration where the images and the depictions are provided for us, we often get perhaps in a certain mode and mood based on what we conjure up in our own mind. So I would ask you another question. And maybe this is an odd way of phrasing it, but nevertheless, what is your favorite Holocaust movie or series? And you know, the juxtaposition of those two terms, favorite, Holocaust, is kind of an odd one.
Schindler's List.
When you think of what movie you've seen related to the Holocaust, which movie do you think is the kind of movie that you would like to see again, that puts you in the right frame of mind, connection with the Shoah?
Schindler's List.
Yeah, there's Schindler's List.
Okay, okay.
Mm-hmm. What else?
Anything else? I hear somebody typing, so I'll wait till it shows up on the chat box. I take it. Life is Beautiful. Okay.
Ironically, The Sound of Music.
Okay. No, not ironic at all. There's certainly a connection there. No question about it. Yeah. Okay. I remember growing up and the kind of films they showed, I forget the names offhand, but very, very harsh films, not these more exploratory films such as Life is Beautiful, such as Schindler's List, where we talk about individual stories, but some of the harsh documentary films where they show the most gruesome and horrifying of pictures. That I remember as a student at Associated and later at Chat, those are the kinds of things that we were exposed to. That's perhaps their goal, was to horrify us, to put us beyond words in a very challenging place. That may have been the purpose, I don't know. And it was before, I suppose, producers and directors were willing to explore different elements of the Shoah. It might have been a certain taboo to an extent that this is the way it had to be portrayed. You couldn't be overly creative or insufficiently harsh with a depiction of the Shoah. It had to be brutal and as documentary as possible. I don't know. I'm kind of surmising it'd be an interesting discussion to talk with directors who first put those films out to the public and how that changed over the years. Barb, you wanted to say something?
One of the images that I do have as a result of that is the horrifying, screaming faces, skulls, just as you say, horrific images.
Okay. So the next question I want to ask you is, what do you recall? I mean, there's nobody here who actually lived through it in an age where we could appreciate what was going on. But what do you recall learning about the Shoah when you grew up, whether in school, from parents, from grandparents? What was presented to you about the Shoah that you recall?
There's a book that's called A Promise of New Spring. And it's an incredible children's book giving you an explanation of the Shoah. And I remember reading that and getting a really good understanding of what was going on.
Okay. Anybody else have some... Didn't learn much in school. Okay. All right.
Public school.
Public school.
Not Jewish day school.
Right. Public school. But that's significant. Where you went and what schools for whom it wasn't a priority, and I say that freely, what they might have presented about those events. And of course, that's only one element of a history or historical narrative that perhaps is neglected, either intentionally or unintentionally, because it's overly challenging. Anyway, okay. What about from your parents or your grandparents? You know, whether they were survivors, witnesses, or whether they had family there. Did they ever talk about that? Did they? Anyone?
It's so interesting that there was not a lot of talk and discussion about it when I was growing up. That's what I'm remembering.
Okay, and I'm kind of glad you mentioned that, because that's certainly an issue with the Shoah for many years, and really, I think, you know, without going into any historical analysis, we find that it took a while for even the Jewish community, let alone the world, to deal openly and discuss openly about it.
Michael, we had some friends who were survivors, and it's interesting that they never ever spoke about it. Their children knew nothing about it, and they wouldn't talk about it. So we really couldn't get any kind of a background.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so my impression from what I'm hearing here is that some people may have had, you know, and again, we don't necessarily have a full cross section, obviously, the Jewish community, but people had different experiences growing up with it. If we talk about the 1950s, the 1960s, 1970s, and it's, I would say that if we look at those who are perhaps under the age of 60, a lot of their exposure, unless their parents or grandparents were survivors, witnesses, has in the last 30 years been often through film or through community commemoration of these events. So I want to for a moment go back. I'm going to put something on the screen that's a bit odd. I did a word search with students a couple of years ago with regards to the Shoah. We call it a Shoah word search. These are the words that I asked them to find in a word search. I'm not going to ask you to do that, don't worry. But when you look at these words, tell me if there's anything there that strikes you as appropriate, inappropriate, with which you have trouble, and tell me why. Any word up there that, you know, the old Sesame Street thing, one of these things is not like the other, one of these things doesn't belong. Is that your feeling about any of the terms on the page in front of you? Remember, the title of this for the students was called Shoah Word Search.
Exodus.
I don't know what Schutzstaffel.
Schutzstaffel is just the full name of the SS. That's what the SS.
Okay. Okay, and Sonderkommando?
So Sonderkommando were those who were involved with special duties, special tasks, literally translated. Those special tasks meant dealing with, for example, removing bodies from the gas chambers and taking them to the crematoria. And those were, of course, for the most part, Jews who did those tasks. I'll come back to that in a minute. So some of the kids said to me, well, what does Syria have to do with the Shoah? And what does Rwanda have to do with Shoah? Why are those? What do those have to do with anything? And without getting into a detailed explanation, I bring this up here because we talk often in many different contexts about cultural appropriation, meaning taking elements of one culture and adopting it as your own. You know, for example, just what seems to be a rather banal example, but it is obviously a rather painful one. People getting dressed up on Halloween in costume that belongs to a different culture, particularly indigenous costume. That was something that people said, no, that's not. Why would you get dressed up as? I mean, that's a fascinating question in itself. What constitutes cultural appropriation? But sometimes in the context, and a much harsher one, with regards to the Shoah, to the Holocaust, we talk about, can those terms be used to describe any other type of genocide or mass murder in another culture? Is Holocaust or Shoah specifically, exclusively Jewish. If it's used in another context, and often with regards to Armenia, more recently, of course, with Rwanda and other places, Serbia, is that cultural appropriation? Is that inappropriate? Is that comparing things that can't possibly compared with one another? And this, we had a fascinating discussion with these teenagers because we often associate those terms, Shoah and Holocaust, as exclusively Jewish. And often the response is, you can't possibly compare whatever happened elsewhere, however harsh and horrible the experience was of another people or another nation, it doesn't compare with the Jewish experience during the Second World War. And we came to the conclusion through some very interesting discussion that comparing doesn't mean they're equal. When you compare two things, it doesn't say this is equal to that. Their experience was exactly like ours. No, it's trying to understand what is different about those experiences. That the whole idea of comparison is to understand what might be similar and what might be different. So we often use the term comparison. We're comparing them, saying because they're equal, they're very similar, and that's all we focus on. Not at all. Comparison makes an effort, if we're sufficiently insightful about it, to try to explain what are the differences and what are the similarities between these two experiences. And you can never say, you can never compare two things. They're too different to compare. That's a very insular and provincial approach to life. The way we learn about things is to be able to understand why they may belong in different categories, why they may be different. But there's almost always something we can find about experiences or narratives where there is something similar. And that sometimes takes a little bit of courage and stepping out of a comfort zone, particularly with the Shoah and with the Holocaust. So we're going to come back to that in a few minutes, but I want to get back to the Parashah for a moment, because I think the Parashah has some fascinating elements that might be worth looking at. My image, when I think about the Shoah, is often something that has to do with fire, burning, something being consumed by fire. And when we look at this week's Parsha, and maybe it's no coincidence that Parshat Shmini often happens around this time of year, I don't know. But we look at these verses at the beginning of the Parsha where we talk about, on the one hand, the set of sacrifices offered by Aaron, and what happens to those sacrifices. They're placed on the altar. This is part of the initiation of the Mishkan, the sanctuary, the temporary sanctuary in the desert. So what does it say? Vatetze eish milifnei Adonai vatochal al hamizbeach et haolav et hachalavim vayar kol ha'am vayaronu vayiplu al pneihem. Fire came forth from before the Lord and consumed the burnt offering and the fat parts on the altar, and all the people saw and shouted and fell on their faces. First of all, in terms of the background, we often consider the only time that people of Israel experience something involving God and some connection, direct connection with God, is at Mount Sinai, is what we call revelation, when the Aseret HaDibrot, or God somehow appears and manifests God's self in some way to the entire people. Not in any direct way as with Moses, because it's something that people can't handle, but there is some kind of national inclusive revelation there at Mount Sinai. But that's not the only time. If you read the text carefully, there are other times where God, and this is one of them, it says very clearly, this God was there. And if we look at the Hebrew for the section just before that, it says, Vayerach vod Adonai el kol ha'am. Just before this verse, it says, and the presence of the Lord appeared to all the people. So there is God appearing to all the people here, well after the revelation at Mount Sinai, but we kind of neglect that. We don't recognize that. But that's something. There was this very powerful manifestation of God, and what's that manifestation? The fire comes forth. They witness fire coming down from the heavens. Apparently, you can only imagine this in some Hollywood cinematic approach, and consuming everything on the altar. And the people saw this and shouted and fell on their faces. A very dramatic event, and perhaps a no less dramatic response. The people saw, they shouted, it elicited a vocal response from them, and they fell on their faces in obeisance, in respect, to what had they just experienced. And then immediately after this event, we hear about the sons of Aaron, at least two of them, Nadav and Avihu, the two elder sons. They bring what is referred to as some kind of strange fire. And I'm not going to go into the discussion of exactly what the nature of their deed was. But immediately after they bring that, and it's quite clear that there is a connection. It says, I'll read the English for you. And now Aaron's sons, Nadav and Avihu, each took his fire pan, put fire in it, and laid incense on it. And they offered before the Lord alien fire, which he had not enjoined upon them. And then immediately, the next verse, Vatetse esh milifnei Adonai vatochal. Exact same words we just read about for this mass appearance of the presence of the Lord before the entire people. The exact same words. But what does it do? Rather than consuming the offering that Nadav and Avihu had placed on the altar, it consumes them. And it says very clearly right afterwards, it's immediately after the statement that says, Asher lo tzivautam, which God had not enjoined, which God had not commanded them to do. They did something that they'd not been asked to do. And again, I don't want to get into a discussion about what could have been so horrible that they did, that they were consumed. That's another discussion. The fact is that the image of fire coming down from the heavens and consuming something in front of the people, and it says Vayamutu lifnei Adonai, and they died at the instance of the Lord. They died in front of the Lord. And interestingly, if you follow my cursor here, the people, after they experienced God's presence and this fire consuming everything on the altar, it says, Vayiplu al pneihem, they fell on their faces. And then here it says, Vayamutu lifnei Adonai, they died. I'm not crazy about this translation. At the instance of the Lord, that's a paraphrase. It uses the same term, pnei, the face, in front of the face of God. So on the one hand, you have the people falling on their faces out of respect, out of fear perhaps, and then the sons of Aaron dying in front of the face of the Lord, in front of the presence of the Lord. And this is something apparently that everyone experienced as well. So I bring this to your attention because this idea of fire is something that is incredibly powerful in the Bible. And you probably recall the confrontation at Mount Carmel between the priests of Baal and the Israelite priests, this contest that Elijah the Navi brings about. And we read about the fact that they put their sacrifices, dozens and dozens of sacrifices they placed on the altar. They call upon their God to send down fire. And of course, nothing happens, not a peep. Everyone's waiting there, and it turns into a mockery. And then Elijah places his offerings on the altar, surrounds it, covers it with water to make it as inconsumable as possible, calls down God to respond, and of course the fire comes and consumes everything in the area. And then a horrible event where Elijah slaughters the priests of Baal, and that's another difficult response to deal with. But this idea of fire coming down from heaven and consuming is something that we identify with in our tradition from the Bible. And that's often an image I have, because when we talk about the image of flame and fire, that's something that's very powerful with regards to the Shoah, with regards to the events of the Holocaust. Perhaps the most horrifying that we talk about are the crematoria. We talk about the fact that the bodies of the Jews were burnt, and the image that we have of the indignities performed en masse to Jews, lifeless, gaunt bodies being taken on a cart from the gas chambers to the crematoria, to the ovens where they were burnt. And as I mentioned before, and I'm glad somebody asked this, if I can use that term, the Sonderkommando, the Jews who had perhaps the most horrifying of tasks was removing bodies from the gas chambers and placing them in the crematoria. And for the few who were fortunate or unfortunate enough to survive, however you view that, and live with that horrible experience, many of them have talked about the fact that the bodies pulled out and placed in the ovens were people they recognized, family members, relatives, friends, people from their same village or community, and we can only imagine, and nothing beyond that, what type of experience and what kind of impact that had on those poor souls. We often blamed and made them victims in accusing them of being able to perform those duties, but none of us would want to be in a position where we would have to choose what to do in terms of trying to save our life, trying to extend our life as long as possible. And in that context, I recently started watching the 3rd season of The Handmaid's Tale. And I don't know how many of you have seen that. If you haven't, it's very powerful in many ways. And of course, the focus is often seen as the subjugation of women. Horribly harsh and a very, very, very powerful series. It's if you've read the book by Margaret Atwood, I would suggest the series is quite fascinating. But what it shows, as much as anything else, is this idea that what happens when a leadership, whatever it may be, takes on a task of subjugating an element of the population, how it is able to, over time, it's not all of a sudden, it doesn't happen all of a sudden, over time, bring the population to the stage where it is able to accept those changes, accept that subjugation. In The Handmaid's Tale, it happens to be women, but it shows you very powerfully what happens when people who perhaps are not women, how they are brought into this, how they are convinced over time that this is something that is for the benefit of all, and even who is able to rebel against those moves. Very few people want to take the chance to do that. And why is that possible? Again, because it's done gradually. It's done in a way that brings people into a mentality out of fear, out of the sense that this will pass. This is not something that's going to get any worse. It's as bad as it's going to get. And yet, things continue to get worse. And there's so much in common with the experience of Europe during the Second World War, how the Nazis were able, over a period of time within Germany and later on in other countries, mostly out of brutality and fear, to maintain institutions of destruction, of subjugation, of all sorts of different groups, not just Jews, although perhaps mainly Jews, but able to do this over an extended period of time because people, out of fear and for the faintest of hope that they might survive, that things might take a turn for the better. So I mention this because it's impossible for us to judge any of those people who didn't take up arms and try to revolt against the Nazis at any time and with any reasonable hope of defeat. There were people who did that knowing that it would cost their lives and the lives of others, but those are few in number. And we, in order to try to comprehend what happened during the Second World War, we have to understand what happens when people are in situations where it's a matter of choosing their life, the lives of their loved ones, and perhaps doing things that they would never dream of doing in any other circumstances. But when it comes to survival, we make different choices than we might ideally make, or what we think we might do, imagining ourselves in that situation. Again, that's a whole issue in itself. But I bring this issue of the fire because I think one of the most fascinating elements is that if fire is the sense of destruction and the tool of destruction, at least one of them during the Shoah, it's also something that we make great efforts to transform into something that for us can be cathartic, that can allow us perhaps to relate to those experiences by transforming a tool and an element of destruction into something that is helpful for us. So we light flames at all sorts of commemoration ceremonies. Here is one taking place in Poland at the Rappaport Memorial in Warsaw on International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which is January the 27th, when the world makes an effort to understand a little bit and commemorate the events of the Second World War. Of course, the Jewish experience, interestingly, on the same day, the 27th, but of a Hebrew month, of the month of Nisan, as opposed to a Gregorian month. So the use of the flame contrasted in our Parashah, where we talk about the flame of destruction consuming the two sons, elder sons of Aaron, as opposed to the flame that consumes the offerings altered in a gesture of satisfaction and acceptance by God from what was offered by Aaron on the altar. And the term used very clearly in contrast to what the sons of Aaron did, it says that just before the fire comes and consumes what Aaron offered, it says, Vaya'aseha kamishpat. Everything he did was according to regulation, according to what he had been told to do. So this acceptance by God because Aaron had followed instructions, and what happens, the implications when you don't follow instructions, and the resulting, of course, in the death of Aaron's two sons. But this harsh contrast between, and maybe a fine line, between the effects of fire. Fire that can be something, a sign of acceptance, a sign of communion with God, as opposed to fire, which can be an element of destruction. And also the contrast in our tradition, the idea that fire can be incredibly destructive, but fire can also be something that allows us to perhaps relate to those harsh events and the destructiveness of fire, but the power that we have to transform that destructive element of fire into something that can be helpful to us, something even an element of healing. And on a perhaps a different level, you may be familiar with the verse in Proverbs in chapter 20 that says, Ner Adonai nishmat Adam chofes kol chadrei vaten. The soul of man is the candle of God to search his innermost depths, revealing all his inner parts. This idea that the candle, and again, something that we use on a regular basis, we use it to commemorate a yurtzeit for an individual, a loved one that we've lost in the past, whether in the past year or early on. We use that same candle to light on Yom HaShoah and Yom HaZikaron LaShoah VeLaGvura. On national memorial days, we use that same candle. And again, when you look at this candle and you compare it to the image we have of a consuming fire, whether in our Parashah or whether we're looking at the smoke and flames coming out of a crematoria from some image or photograph from the Second World War, this fire, especially this picture here, often has a very calming effect. It's not something that threatens us. It's something that, to which we're powerfully drawn, I think. I mean, I've always had a fascination with fire, and looking at the image of that candle, it's something that allows us, in the sense of the verse from Proverbs, to try to explore. It encourages us to maybe explore those painful incidents where fire was more destructive. It encourages us to explore and research those narratives for which we've lit a candle in memory. And when we light memorial or yurtzeit candles, and especially I would say in the case of today, a national memorial candle, as I mentioned before, it can be a cathartic experience. It's a matter of harnessing and utilizing that light of the flame, the positive element of the flame, as opposed to its destructive consuming element, to explore the past and find meaning in those events. And I think with regards to the Shoah, it means exploring what for the Jewish people, of course, is a horribly painful narrative. At the same time, acknowledging that in our search for meaning, we probably aren't going to find meaning. It doesn't mean we're going to find something. But there is, I would say, a comfort and a dignity in bringing to light details of those tragic events. At the same time, as we try to remember the lives of those who perished, not in their moments of indignity, of death, of crematoria, of burial pits, but to remember, and that's what this yurtzeit candle really should be for, and memorial candle, to remember them in their lives, what type of lives they lived. And I think many of us have different approaches to how we relate to the Shoah and how we try to come some kind of experience with it. I say experience rather than understanding because I don't think we can understand what the Shoah is. We can understand the facts. We can read and try to expose ourselves to as much of the narrative as possible from as many different perspectives as possible. And that means not just reading the accounts of survivors, of witnesses to that event, but reading, as painful as it may be, reading accounts of Nazis, of German soldiers who served in these places, because there is ample literature on that, which gives us some insight of how some of these people came to the point where they were able to perform the tasks assigned to them by their superiors and accepted them in whatever manner. And that's part of our understanding, in as broad a perspective as possible, this narrative that we refer to as the Shoah. And I think that's part of what we need to do today. If and when you light a candle looking at that flame and try to explore something that's not familiar to you. And I would ask you, rhetorically at this point, what are you going to do today, and it's a challenge, of course, to allow that candle of exploration and research and curiosity to bring to light for you? What aspect of the Shoah, unexplored by you until now, are you going to seek out today? So my challenge is to you, don't see a movie you've seen, as much as it may be comfortable. Don't go see Life is Beautiful if you've seen it. Don't watch Schindler's List. Watch something that you haven't seen. Personally, for me, I'm going to come back to this in a moment. I saw a film many years ago that was made in Israel in the 1970s called Hamakah Hashmonim Ve'echad, the 81st blow. And that 81st blow is refers to a survivor who received 80 lashes from a Nazi. What's the 81st blow? He survived. He went to Israel and he was confronted by denial and the fact that people did not believe what happened. And of course, we know of many instances of that Israel for many years and the Jewish community at large did not want to try to cope with the Shoah and did not deal with survivors in terms of accepting them and legitimizing their experience, their narrative, because the Israeli psyche was one of independence, was this new Jew, new Israeli with strength and resolve to determine its own destiny. And how could Jews have allowed themselves to be in a position as they were in Europe, and how could they have allowed those events to take place? And for many years, survivors faced that type of response from Israel. And this was the 81st blow for this survivor. And this movie was very powerful, giving documentary evidence for the most part, but not just that. This idea that the denial that he faced, the lack of acknowledgements, and the silence that he faced in terms of people being willing to accept his experience as something that was legitimate and relevant. And that brings me to the final thing I want to mention, if only briefly at this point, and that is the response of Aaron. I'm going to go back to our Parashah. What does it say about Aaron's response to the fact that his sons died? So Moses comes out with something immediately after Nadav and Avi, who perish in that consuming fire. And he says something that is a little bit mysterious. He says, Moses said to Aaron, in comfort, or we're not sure, this is what the Lord meant when he said, through those near to me, I show myself holy and gain glory before all the people. If those are words of comfort, I'm not sure. And what is Aaron's response to this and to what happened to his sons? Vayidom Aharon. And Aaron was silent. And I find those to be two of the most incredibly powerful words in the entire Bible. We have no idea what Aaron was feeling. We can only imagine. His sons, he had just done something, performed what he was supposed to do. God receives it, consumes it. And then moments later, his sons, for whatever reason, in whatever frame of mind, drunk, enthusiastic, exuberant about what's going on, perhaps wanting to show their devotion and creativity in offering something. We don't know. And at this point, it doesn't matter. But Aaron is silent. And I say that those are incredibly powerful because when I think about his silence, these are the images I come up with. If his sons did something that wasn't acceptable, Why is Aaron silent? Why does he not complain? Perhaps because what comes to mind? You know what? It wasn't long ago that I offered up something that was unacceptable as well. I made a golden calf for the Israelites when Moses was up on Mount Sinai. And what happened to me? Nothing. Some kind of reprimand from Moses, but here I am, leading the children of Israel in sacrifice, running that whole institution in this temporary sanctuary. How can I possibly say anything? I got off the hook and my sons didn't. And maybe, this is something that came to mind, perhaps you might say this is stretching it a bit too far, but we all watch sports games when an umpire, a referee, misses a call on a penalty. And there's a sense that, hey, how did you miss that? He tripped him, he hit him, he slashed him, he fouled him. And then 3 minutes later, a very questionable call where probably nothing really happened, the umpire makes an effort to balance out that bad call and makes a call on something that probably shouldn't have been, but in order for people to be satisfied about that missed call. And perhaps that's the kind of frame of mind Aaron was in. God missed this on me. I should have been punished. Now my sons are being punished because of what I did and was not punished for. That's something that I think about when I look at this incident here. I think that more importantly, though, is we don't know what Aaron did. All we know that he was silent. And when I think of this painting by Edvard Munch, we call it, the scream. I don't hear anything when I look at that picture. That scream to me is a silent scream, because whoever is screaming, whatever the reasons for this person with that expression on their face, they're not able to get out the sound. And I think in this instance here, maybe that's what Aaron was doing. It said he was silent, but perhaps this is the look on his face when he saw what happened to his sons. And I don't know what your experience has been, but I've had dreams where I've been in a frightening situation, a threatening situation, and I try to utter some kind of sound and nothing comes out in my dream. And it's horribly, horribly frightening. I do my utmost and nothing comes out. Nothing comes out. And I think the wisdom and the beauty of the Torah is that it legitimizes different responses. Is silence the best way to deal with something? I don't know. But the Torah says that's what happens to some people. They're unable to utter a sound. They can't do that. And we may be convinced, either by our own experience and needs, as well as the opinions of respected psychologists, that talking about pain and loss is part of the healing process and is something which we should always encourage. But the Torah, I think, shows its brilliance by offering alternatives, sometimes critically and sometimes without any apparent judgmentalism. We know that Job screamed out at the loss of his children, even though he accepted it. We recall David lamenting the untimely death of his beloved, if rebellious son, Avshalom. So there are vocal expressions of pain and loss there. But here we have somebody who is unable to express anything in any kind of vocal or visceral way. The only thing we have is perhaps some kind of visual image of what Aaron might have been going through, but we have nothing to connect to in terms of any kind of sound. And I think the Torah is telling us that's sometimes people respond that way, and you have to accept that. That's as legitimate. It leaves to our imagination more than anything else, and the incumbent upon us to try to empathize with Aaron without having any kind of vocal experience to lead us, to direct us. And of course, silence is something that perhaps it has a relevance and a legitimacy and should be acknowledged in personal challenges, whatever the nature of that challenge or trauma may be. When it refers to injustice and things that affect the lives of others, silence is something that is not acceptable. That's when silence is not a relevant alternative. When we see things happening to others, when we see others being persecuted, subjugated, that's when silence is not something that can be acceptable. That's when we need not to scream, holding our head without being heard. That's exactly when we need to be heard. And I come back, of course, to the Shoah when we talk about the experience of Jews and others who've suffered and have been subjected to harsh persecution, wherever it may be, whether it's Rwanda, whether it's Serbia, whether it's Syria, whether it's Armenia, or whether it's Gilead, that imaginary place in The Handmaid's Tale. That's when we have to take some kind of vocal action and sometimes beyond vocal action. That's when we have to take on the responsibility because silence is not a legitimate response in that case. Silence is something we can accept in dealing with our own personal experience and challenges, but not when it affects the lives of others. And as we commemorate Yom HaShoah, I hope that acknowledging the pain that we've experienced as a people in the past is something that encourages you and urges you, I would say, not to be silent, but to make sure that you learn about the experiences of others in our own community and outside of our own community and speak out against it. There's no room in our society, there should be no room for some of the things that are going on. And we've talked about this in different sessions. Black Lives Matter, the culture and identity of Indigenous people should be of concern to us. And those are only two groups. And certainly the subjugation of any group based on gender, based on ethnic origin, based on language, based on faith community is something that we should not be tolerating. And I urge you all, as I mentioned before, to explore some element of the Shoah that allows you to see things in a wider perspective and the broadest of all pictures to make sure that those kinds of things don't happen again. So I thank you all for joining me this morning. Part of that, hopefully, and I'll give you a chance to, if you want to share any comments, I hope that you'll all join the community international at that reading of Megillat HaShoah taking place at 11 o'clock this morning. It's a simple process to go online on the website, register for it, very, very easy, and join what promises to be a very moving experience in different languages with participants from around the world. And hopefully that's something that will give you some kind of meaningful connection with events of the Shoah and Gvura. So anyone who would like to share some comments, please.
Michael, I had a couple of thoughts about something you said earlier when you said, why did God not punish Aaron when he made the golden calf? Two thoughts. One is that perhaps with the slaying of his sons, that was a worse punishment for Aaron. And the other thought was, what was it now? It sort of escaped me. I guess that's it. That was what I was thinking.
Okay.
As an aside, at the opposite spectrum, would the Ner Tamid be a calming, positive influence of the flame that is always with us?
I think so. I think our association, I mean, most people's association with flame, I think the first thing that comes up is often in the Jewish experience is the Yahrzeit candle or the Shabbat candles,
Right.
something that gives us a connection to something very positive in our tradition.
Yeah.
But I think we need to be aware of the fact that that flame is something that can be used for different purposes and it has been.
Yeah.
The other thing was, could it have been that what Aaron did was before the giving of the commandments and the sons after? Why they were slain and Aaron was not? It
It could be. I just think that when we talk about people in positions of power and leadership and responsibility, the Torah encourages us in a number of instances in the narrative, as well as in later rabbinic literature, that those people have to be held to a higher standard. We have expectations of them. They need to be out in front of things. They can't be only responding and reacting, and they certainly can't allow themselves, although they're humans and it happens, to act in a way that would not provide the type of example, personal example, to others whom they lead. And so when a leader such as Moses merely hits a rock rather than following instructions clearly and showing that not everything has to be done perhaps with a violent action, he's punished quite harshly, not being allowed. Yeah, sure, you can justify and say, well, he's a ruler, he's a leader whose time has come. He's not the right guy to lead us. So what? Let him be a leader emeritus and come into the Holy Land and be part of the experience without being in a leadership position. But that didn't happen. His punishment is quite severe. He's not allowed even to enjoy the fruits of the Exodus and the Revelation and the 40 years of wandering and growth and development in the desert. He doesn't get a chance to see that. So he is held to an incredibly high standard. We might have thought the same should have applied to Aaron. Yes, you can say that perhaps this is before the revelation at Sinai, but he's in a leadership position. A leadership position has certain responsibilities regardless of what the full understanding of laws may be. Leadership is leadership. And if you're going to lead, you need to do so by example. And I can't say from my understanding of the events of the golden calf that Aaron led so proficiently by example in allowing that golden calf just to happen to pop out of the gold that he put into a pot. I mean, that's and not even taking full responsibility for it. That's as powerful as anything else. Making this excuse that, they came to me, they kind of made me do it. I didn't have a choice, and I gathered all the stuff, and like out of this, a golden calf appeared. Really?
True.
Okay, plenty of stuff for thought. So I hope we'll see you later on at 11 o'clock. And if not, look forward to seeing you at the next opportunity, learning, experiential, ritual, whatever it may be. Stay safe. Do what you need to do to keep everybody around you safe as well, but stay active in a safe way.
Thank you,
Thank
Mike.
you for the insightful class. Excellent.
Mary.
Everybody take care and stay well. Yes, thank you.
Keep well.
Stay
keep
safe,
safe.
everybody.